On this Sunday morning with Mike Bernard from OTM Sports out in Las Vegas. Mike, how are you?
Doing well, Coach. How about yourself?
Oh, just trying to shake off the cobwebs from a long day of watching football. And of course, I know you've got a big day of NFL games coming up.
Yeah, we do. Yesterday wasn't the best of days. We had K-State that won, but Central Florida got drubbed, and then Jim Harbaugh put a little finishing touch on that game that hurt us because we had Purdue plus 17 in that game.
Yeah, Tulane, Willie Fritz has done a really good job at Tulane. Uh, they haven't they haven't been good for a very, very long time. Hard to believe that once upon a time, and I actually remember this, shows you how old I am. I remember when Tulane was actually in the Southeastern Conference.
Right. Well, you don't even have to go back that far. I believe it was around 2000. They went undefeated with Sean King as their quarterback. I don't. Was that around the about 20
To-
years ago?
Tommy Bowden was the head
Yeah.
coach. Rich Rodriguez was the offensive coordinator. And that's what actually it's kind of funny how all this stuff goes full circle. That's kind of what propelled Tommy Bowden to Clemson. And speaking of Clemson, they won another ACC title last night, 39-10 over the Tar Heels of North Carolina. Clemson finishes the year at a disappointing 11-2. I don't know what's going on up there. I think Dabo needs to be fired. They need to burn the place to the ground. And of course, I'm being very facetious, but that's kind of the sentiment of some of the Clemson fans now. A few years ago, hadn't been that long ago, Clemson would have been excited to go to the Gator Bowl and been happy and thought that was the greatest thing in the world. And now they're ticked off because they're not in the playoffs every year.
Right. If they did get in this year, it would have been 7 out of 9. Is that right?
Yeah.
So they're only in the playoffs 6 out of 9 years, and fan is short for fanatic.
Yeah, it is. And you take into consideration that loss to South Carolina with what happened yesterday, they would probably be in today at the number 4 spot.
I think you're right. I think you're right because that criteria of conference champion, and they would only have that one loss. That game cost them.
Speaking of the 4th spot, the dreaded and coveted 4th spot, USC lost out on it Friday night. Utah, as you and I both expected, Utah was going to be that. They just don't match up good against USC, or USC doesn't match up good against Utah. Utah matches up very well against USC.
Yeah, and not a lot of teams match up well with Utah, especially in postseason type games because Whittingham he's outstanding in those games. They had, I believe Utah ended up with 3 losses. One of them was to Florida in week 1, but that was they really should have won that game. But even with 2 losses, they still wouldn't be in the mix, I don't think.
LSU and Georgia. LSU actually had opportunities to stay in this game and some just weird bounces of the ball and crazy mistakes. Just cost the Tigers dearly. Georgia 50-30. I think Georgia would have won no matter what, but LSU had a chance to keep this game a lot closer. Georgia, of course, they'll stay the number 1 seed. Michigan 43-22. They'll be the number 2 seed. Now, 3 and 4 is up in the air right now. And of course, Kansas State beat TCU 31-28 in overtime. Now, we'll just go right ahead and get into what our different opinions are of what's going to happen. I think just by virtue of the one loss, even though they didn't play in the conference championship game, I think Ohio State, I think they slide up into the number 4 spot. I think that TCU, I think they stay at number 3 despite the loss, really because of how they lost, and it was to a team that they had beaten earlier in the year. So I look at the seedings to be number 1 Georgia, number 2 Michigan, number 3 TCU, and number 4 Ohio State.
I can't argue with that. And again, every year, when it comes to resume, TCU should stay in. If you're going on who's the best team, maybe you could consider Alabama, but this is not the year for a 2-loss team to be in the Final Four, in my opinion. This Alabama team, I've said it over and over, it's the worst team that Saban's had since year one. So how do you put them in? And with 2 losses, they don't have any quality wins.
They have no quality win. Their best win is against a Texas team that they had to have some breaks to win that game. And one of the and again, you hate to say, well, if this guy had played, that guy had played, but we talked about it. If Bryce Young had played against Texas A&M, maybe Alabama wouldn't have come down to one play, at the end of the game. But Quinn Ayers had the hot hand that day early on. He was moving the ball up and down the field. He was knocked out, I believe, still in the first quarter when he was knocked out of the game. And Alabama had to have a late field goal to win that game. TCU goes into Austin. They handle business. The score 17-10. Game really wasn't that close.
No. And look, as far as any type of debate, you have resume and you have best team. So I will qualify and say that if Alabama's playing TCU, even this year's version, I'm gonna if the game is pick, I'm all over Alabama because number one, they have Bryce Young, and I think they would beat TCU. But the frustrating thing for most fans with the committee, and for the most part, they get it right. But the frustrating thing is they use these words and then they use them to just justify what they did. And then one year it's like, hey, these are the 4 best. And the next time it's like, well, we went by resume. So that's the frustrating thing. And after next year, I don't think we're going to have this discussion anymore.
I don't think we will. I think we'll go to the discussion of the number 13. We should have been in. We were just as good as number 12. That's the discussion we'll be having. But then, of course, I think that'll be just like in the basketball tournament. I think those things will be laughed off after about 30 seconds. But, let's talk about Alabama just a little bit. I mean, and again, you would be favored, I think, and of course, this is your world, not mine. But if you look at these, you look at the top 4 teams as you and I have them, I think Alabama would be favored definitely against TCU, probably favored against Ohio State at that matter. But would they be or close?
I think they would be favored. They would be favored over Michigan, and they would be favored over TCU. They would be favored over TCU by more than a touchdown. But as far as Ohio State, that might be one of those cases where they open it around pick or 1 either side and let the betting public decide.
Right. And the thing with Alabama that I look at is that, again, they have 2 losses. They don't have any quality wins. And I put TCU's resume and Alabama's resume side by side. And the only thing that I can really see that pushes Alabama over the top, again, to say, well, they would be favored. Well, if it's just going to be based upon who's favored, then let's just pick teams off of who. Let Vegas pick the teams. Let Vegas say these teams are favored, and let's take the top 4 teams that way. And I still think from a coaching standpoint, what you do on the field matters. What you have done on the field affects where your seed is. And with the 2 loss, I don't see Alabama. I don't see Alabama deserving at this point. And again, they may be the best team in the nation, but guess what? They had a chance to show it, and they didn't. Of course, you and I both know that they're not the best team in the nation this year. But again, a Nick Saban squad, you put them in a situation where you got to win a football game. Sometimes it's hard to bet against that guy.
Yeah, I mean, if Alabama were to get in, the other 3 teams would not want to see Bryce Young on the other side of the field, right? No. I mean, but again, the Alabama defense this year it's not Alabama standards. The Alabama team as a whole, their receiving core, they're not there. But again, it goes back to the argument of resume deserving versus the best teams. And they just use the arguments when it fits their need.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, TCU, losing yesterday, if they had to lose, that was the way to lose in overtime, in a in a game that went back and forth, back and forth. That was the way to lose a game if you're going to lose it. And I harken back to back the old, I guess the old BCS days. Florida State, goes to Notre Dame and they lose at Notre Dame, and they pleaded. Bobby Bowden pleaded, this was a blimp. We get a chance. We're gonna, we'll show you, and they did. They got in the national championship game and won it that year. Now,
that was Charlie Ward.
Exactly. Real quick on TCU. You and I, and we talked on this show just a minute ago. We talked about it. How Alabama will be favored. Everybody's going to beat the brakes off TCU. And if you look at it, TCU's had some close calls, just like Alabama. But the difference is TCU, they won those close calls. They ran out. They kicked a field goal against Baylor. They won those close calls. Alabama did not win those close calls. And don't give me but look who they were playing. No, you play who's on the field. You take care of business with who's on the field. So, you and I, again, off the air, we thought, well, man, this is going to be the week for TCU. Yeah, they're going to go down this week. They're going to go down this week. And, they went down yesterday, but they're a solid football team.
They're solid. Again, there would be an underdog to Alabama, but that goes back to the other argument. And here's the thing. A couple of things. If Alabama managed the clock better in Knoxville and they lost in overtime, then they would have 2 overtime losses, just like the 07 LSU Tigers that made it to the BCS. So that would have given the committee some more leeway to say, oh, well, we can put Alabama in. The other thing, and the biggest thing that, excuse me, most people don't want to hear anymore, but it's absolutely true, is the SEC fatigue started it really began in 06 when Florida got in, because remember, before 06, the SEC was nothing in the eyes of the BCS.
It was all USC, baby.
That's right. And Pete Carroll and their winning streak until he blew that game, which was probably one of the top 5 games ever, that game against Texas. But the point is if you go back and everyone complains about, is Alabama going to get in? How does, SEC has 2 teams. You know whose fault that is? It's the Big 12, the Pac-12, some years the Big 10. But if you go back and you could stop all this, right? If the teams don't fall to the pressure of November and the pressure of Championship Saturday, and they just, I don't care if you use choke or what have you, you go back and look year by year. It's Baylor, K-State, Oregon, TCU, Oklahoma State. And they all lose in West Virginia back in the BCS days. So that gets these SEC teams in position. It's not a conspiracy. And then on top of that, once the SEC teams get in, sometimes by default, they dominate. So that kind of solidifies their position. So I don't buy into the conspiracy that, that's this and that. We know that the dollar drives most things. But if those other conferences don't choke, then the SEC is not in the position they are in today.
Let's go back and of course, it ended up being another SEC team that benefited from it. But we go back to you're talking about the pressures of November and choking. I look at go back to Alabama. Alabama had a clear run to get into another national title race, and Nick Saban decided to kick a 78-yard field goal down at Auburn one night. I mean, that's those type things. Those type things happen. And had that situation put a team from the Big 12 or a team from the Pac-12 or Big 10 in the championship game instead of – go ahead.
Well, I would just go ahead and finish your thought, because on that same year, there's another thing. I don't know if you're going to get to it, but Nick Saban, that decision to kick a 57-yard field goal when it's 40 degrees, when that was the all-time school record off of a tee downwind, right? And that was one of his few major blunders. But yeah, so that knocked Alabama out. But remember, in order for Auburn to get in, Ohio State had to choke.
Yes,
and they did.
They did against Michigan State. And again, have you got just a few more minutes?
I do.
Okay.
I'd rather talk about this than study NFL right now.
There you go. Well, speaking of that year, and again, Ohio State, I mean, they were a dominant team until that night in Indianapolis against Michigan State. I think it's time for these, with the expanded playoffs, I think it's time for these conference championships to go away. And I'll tell you why. Is because back when you actually played people in your conference and there was a legitimate case for saying, hey, we beat everyone in the conference and we're the conference champion. Now you're the conference champion and you may not even play everyone in the conference. Now, again, back in the BCS days, and the SEC started all this by taking an archaic rule that was designed strictly for Division III schools. And the crazy thing, it was designed for Division III schools to help with the playoff seedings of a 16-team field. But Roy Kramer, in his wisdom, saw this as could be a huge cash cow. And of course, as soon as the SEC did it, all the other conferences came on board with that because they saw the financial benefit of it. But if we have a 12 and I hope ultimately a 16-team playoff, there's no need for a conference championship game, none whatsoever. Because right now, the only thing that playing in a conference championship game does, it gives you the opportunity to get beat again. Ohio State's going to get on. Ohio State's going to get in because USC played in a conference championship game. That's the only reason. The only reason Ohio State's getting in. Several years ago, Alabama was not the West champion. LSU was. LSU had already beaten Alabama. LSU has to go to Atlanta, beat Georgia, and then play Alabama again. It's time, and however they need to do it to make sure that the money keeps rolling in, but they need to get rid of these conference championship games because, quite frankly, winning them doesn't help you anymore.
Right. And, in some cases, it certainly does not. But here's the thing. The conferences get that money exclusively, and they're not going to share that, and I agree with you. I would rather have that remain a postseason spot instead of championships. You still need your championship Saturday for the conferences that aren't involved in the top 12. But I don't think it'll happen because of the money, because all that money goes straight to the conferences. And the problem with back in the days when the conferences had 8 and 10 teams, you could play everyone. Now the SEC is about to have 16. The Big Ten already has 14. You can't play everyone. And I don't know the answer, but this year the Big Ten East had the top 3 teams. Purdue was 4th or 5th best of the conference, and they're playing in a title game. So that's an argument to get rid of divisions. We've seen a lot of other conferences, Pac-12 this year, notably, the ACC. And that's another thing, Coach. If Pac-12 doesn't get rid of the divisions, who does USC play? Right? They don't play Utah because they're both in the Pac-12 South. Right. So that decision, they made the decision, and I think rightfully so, to increase their chances of getting into the playoff. As it turns out, it ended up hurting them.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you exactly when they will get rid of conference championship games. Is they will get rid of conference championship games when the ESPNs and the Foxes sit down and say, okay, we can make more money off expanding the playoffs and getting rid of these conference championship games. When the TV money goes away, because that's where the money comes from. That's
Right.
that's where the overflow is from the TV deals. And when those TV deals, when the powers that be from the television networks say we're not paying this anymore, we're going to do it like this. Guess what? As big bad as these schools like to act, except for Notre Dame, which they're able to hold their line pretty hard, but all these other schools they'll get in line.
Yeah, I think so. And it was almost remember the pushback with before the BCS, like, oh, we need to keep tradition. And frankly,
Mm-hmm.
I loved college football growing up, but it towards the end before BCS, you realize like, wait a minute, what is this figure skating?
Yeah.
Because you're just having this. You have teams that you didn't have any of these preseason games. Like
Mm-hmm.
people can knock Alabama's schedule, but when Saban got there, his first game out was against a notable power team. He never lost any of them,
Mm-hmm.
and he played Michigan, Wisconsin, USC. Back then in the day, in the 90s, in the 70s and 80s, you would see some of that, but in the 90s, you didn't see any of that. So you would have even the early part of the BCS. Remember, you had Michigan and Nebraska split.
Mm-hmm.
So we've gotten a lot better, right? We've
Yeah.
improved, and now we're about to see 12. Sure, we're going to miss out on these type of conversations with the four,
Mm-hmm.
but I think the next conversation will be, well, why did so and so to get a bye and this team not?
Yeah. And that's the good thing. So you go to 16 teams, you don't have to worry about that. Nobody
Well,
gets a bye.
don't you think to go to 16, you truly have to alter the whole season and go with 10 regular season games?
Well, if you get rid of the conference championship games, then you don't have to worry about it.
We'll see. And
And
I think
and
today's
listen, and again, I'm only, I was born when we still use kerosene lamps for lighting and everything, and we sent our mail by horse. But I remember Ohio State winning a national championship at 10-0. And I mean 10-0 after the bowl game. They played 9 regular season games. I remember growing up, some teams played 9 games. Most played 10 always, but there were some years that some teams played 9 regular season games. And and again, the 11th game started um, back in the early 70s. The 11th game started again, as everything else, money driven. And then all of a sudden, every once in a while, you would have a team that would play. You'd have 5 or 6 teams that would end up playing 12 games because they would get invited to one of these preseason kickoff classics and everything.
yeah, up in
And
New
so,
Jersey or
yeah, New Jersey, and I think one year they played 2 or 3 out in Anaheim on the Angels baseball stadium there. But anyway, bottom line, that's how we got into 12 games. And and colleges are able to sell a season ticket package for more because, oh, you don't have 5 home games, we have 7 home games. Now again, one of them's against Soki Newcomb School for the Deaf and Blind, and the other one's for Little Sisters of the Poor, but we still got 7 home games.
right, right. And then you can't give those tickets away, but they count towards and it's not at Alabama and Auburn and some of these SEC schools, it's outrageous how much season tickets cost.
Mm-hmm.
But remember, with television, all that money comes in. But also, if you look at the data,
Mm-hmm.
the attendance in college football is way down and it's been trending down for about 8 years.
Yeah. And I'll tell you one thing that I kind of did a little spit take last night when I heard Saban at halftime of the Michigan and Purdue game talk about how Alabama finished the season strong with 3 wins against some really strong teams. And I'm thinking, wait a second, Ole Miss, who lost 4 of their last 5, Austin P, a 1AA school, and a team that was playing with an interim coach and had turmoil for the last year and a half. But hey, football coaches are like politicians. We're going to say what we need to say to get to where we want to be.
He was on that show for two reasons. Number one, to pitch his team. Number two, maybe 1A, is recruiting. Remember, early on in his career, Saban would have never done that. He's just evolved to where he understands, hey, I got to get out and promote.
Yeah. I think there's going to be I don't think that Nick Saban will ever retire because of a lack of energy. I think he will just probably at one point in time say, I'm sick of this and I'm out of here.
Right. And I don't even know if he'll do that because I don't think he's driven by trophies anymore. I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's driven by the challenge of helping young men and focusing on the process and doing other things, because after you win so many trophies, that's really, I know that's what the fans expect, but he feels like if he does the other things well, the trophies will come. So but it doesn't drive him anymore.
Yeah, I had a buddy of mine tell me just this past week that that this coming year is his last year to coach because he said it's just not as simple as it used to be.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, he doesn't look, what is he, 70?
Yeah,
he doesn't look it.
Yeah. And I'm not talking, this was not coming from Nick Saban. I'm not referring to Nick Saban. I'm talking about another friend of ours has already made the decision. I'm not talking about Saban. No.
Oh, okay.
Let me clarify
misheard.
that before I get blasted. No, but again, the point being is coaching is just not as simple as it used to be.
Especially with the transfer portal and the development of super conferences, and this now we have the 12-team playoff. And at some point, the fans always say things like, well, he'll have a better chance to win a national title at this school. Well, there's also there's quality of life component there too, right? So we don't, as fans, we don't really bring that up a lot, but a lot of coaches won't go to a certain school or a club in the NFL because it's going to be a downgrade on quality of life.
Yeah, it definitely. Now, speaking of quality of life and upgrades and downgrades, Coach Prime, Dion to Colorado, announced late last night officially. We've kind of known about it for several days now. Couldn't say anything, but he's gone. So, now I think now we're getting ready to find out exactly how good of a coach Deion Sanders is.
Right. And he's going to have to change too. All right. Because no matter what you say, there's a big difference between 1AA and then Power 5. But he's prime time. He'll adjust. I mean, he's going to bring the players in. I see him on Twitter almost every day appealing to recruits and in their language. And he's going to get players, and especially the transfer portal right up his alley. I mean, look, he's going to get athletes there. And I feel like he's a player's coach. The only problem I would see is if you have a situation like if he wouldn't fit at Auburn, because I don't know many coaches that do because of the scenario there.
Yeah.
With, boosters and powers that be and so forth. But other than that, if you let him build his program, I think he'll do okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Auburn got the best fit that they could find. I don't think there's a better fit for Auburn out there than Hugh Freeze. And I think Hugh Freeze is an excellent coach, but I'm not saying he's the best coach in college football. The best
he's
coach
one of the top 10. He's a top 10 coach for a lot of people in my community.
Yeah, and he's a top 10 coach in my book. But being there are coaches that are, and again, all this is subjective, but there are coaches who are better than Hugh Freeze that couldn't fit in at Auburn. Nick Saban couldn't fit in at Auburn.
No, and remember the story when he first went to Alabama, he had to tell all the blue bloods and the powers that be, like, you don't matter. Yeah. And that's and a lot of people don't have the ability to do that.
That's right. Well, listen, we've kept you too long, but we appreciate your time as always, and we'll be chatting again on the Morning Blitz.
Yep. Look forward to it. Have a great Sunday.